A lightning offensive by opposition fighters in Syria sweeps onwards after Aleppo falls. President Bashar al-Assad vows they'll be defeated despite little resistance from his forces. So what's next for Syria and the other countries involved in the war? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm James Bays. They say a week is a long time in politics, but in Syria, events unimaginable just 7 days ago have been rapidly unfolding, or in terms of government control of swathes of territory, unravelling. Opposition forces have swept through largely unchallenged, taking over Aleppo, the country's second city, and are pushing ahead. With attention in the region focused on Gaza and Lebanon, Syria's frozen civil war had seemed dormant. No one predicted what was to happen, with questions now about just how firm President Bashar al-Assad's grip on power really is. They're underlined by the difficulties his key allies, Hezbollah, Iran and Russia, face elsewhere. So how has this happened and why now? What's the impact for Syria's people? And what will Iran, Russia, Turkey, Hezbollah and the US do next? All of them with forces active in the country. We'll speak to our panel of guests in a moment. But first, this report from Laura Khan.
A new front reignites after years of frozen conflict. Syrian government forces strike Idlib after an opposition offensive. Convoys of armoured vehicles entering an area west of the city of Hama, led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, formerly linked to al-Qaeda. The Syrian army denies its withdrawal from the area. But it appears to have offered little resistance to a lightning offensive on Aleppo earlier in the week. Syrian opposition forces revelled in their advance. By Friday, in the heart of the city, they chanted, Damascus, Hama and Homs will be next.
Our main goal was to expel the gangs that were in Aleppo, as they oppressed the people with extreme injustice and suffering.
But the opposition advance is a major setback to Bashar al-Assad's government. He took control of the city in 2016 and drove out opposition forces with the backing of Russia and Iran. They hadn't attacked the city again, until now. Although Assad controls 2/3 of Syria, much of the north has been carved up into areas under the control of different factions. The northeast is under the American-backed and Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces. Idlib's considered a stronghold of HTS, while the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army holds an area in the north. Russia, Iran and the Lebanese fighting group Hezbollah have supported Assad's government for more than a decade, with military assistance from the air and ground. But more recently, Hezbollah has been fighting a war with Israel and Russia in Ukraine, while Iran has been in conflict with Israel.
Hezbollah and Iran have played a key role in, and with the Russian support, to sustain the regime as it. The Turks saw a window of opportunity now to change this dysfunctional status quo that does not work for their own interests. Why is this? Turkey has been struggling with an influx of millions of Syrian refugees.
The new offensive means more insecurity for people caught up in the violence. More than 7 million people have already been forced from their homes by a war that's raged since 2011. And many are crowded into small pockets of land in northern Syria, living in unsanitary conditions. The latest fighting has forced thousands more to move.
I left with my children and family along with all these people because of the escalating attacks and shelling. We left and became displaced in this area, and hopefully we will go back home safely.
Many people are questioning how Assad's defences fell so quickly in Aleppo, and what that means for international backers of the different sides in Syria, and whether the latest offensive will lead to a wider escalation or force the warring forces back to the negotiating table. Laura Khan for Inside Story, Al Jazeera.
Well, let's bring in our guests now on today's programme. In Cardiff, Aymenn Jawad al-Tamimi is Research Fellow at the Middle East Forum and a specialist on Islamic State and other non-state armed groups in Syria. In London, Fuad Saeed Issa is the founder of the Violet Aid Organisation, a refugee and youth-led humanitarian group working in northwestern Syria. And in Erbil, Iraq, Ranj al-Alaaldin is a fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. Thank you. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us on today's programme. Let me start with you, Aymenn. I first reported from Syria more than 30 years ago, and rarely have I seen events as startling as these. How surprised have you been?
Well, I was very surprised by what happened. And I think actually also, very importantly, also it should be stressed, the Syrian government forces and their allies were very surprised and taken by the very fact, I think, that the insurgents launched a major offensive. I think they've gotten used to the idea that basically the conflict would be frozen virtually indefinitely because of the Turkish-Russian understandings that were worked out in the ceasefire for the northwest region in 2020. That's not to say, of course, they might not have received. That's not to say they didn't necessarily receive any indication of an intention by the insurgents to launch the offensive, but it seems to me they just didn't take it seriously. And if they did receive such indications and they didn't make the proper preparations in fortifying the front lines and properly manning and defending them, and now you see this rapid collapse that has happened as a result. It's a real break from the status quo of the past 5 years.
Let me ask Ranj then to pick up there. Why do you think the regime forces were caught so off guard?
Well, I think the context is particularly important in this discussion. So the post-October 7 escalation has seen a severe degradation of the regime and its allies in Syria, the Iranians in particular. I wouldn't say this is so much a question of being prepared, but rather being occupied with other conflict theaters, other issues, but also maybe a degree of complacency. The Assad regime has enjoyed a normalization of its relations with the wider region, with the Arab world. That's been driven by several countries that once upon a time were on the opposing side of the spectrum. So that complacency, I think, is important in that respect. Secondly, there's been a degradation of the regime's infrastructure, military infrastructure in the country, namely the Iran-aligned forces and their own organizational capacity. That's largely in part as a result of Israel's targeted assassination of key IRGC personnel within Syria itself. But ultimately, I think, once upon a time, this conflict was driven by the region, and the international element was secondary to that. Right now, what we're seeing as a consequence of that normalization, Assad's reintegration into the Arab world, is a limited appetite for a renewal of the so-called paused civil war. And I think a combination of those factors is ultimately what led perhaps to the regime being complacent. The Russians, most crucially, are occupied in Ukraine. But that doesn't mean there won't be a pushback over the coming hours and days. The pushback has actually started already. So what we're going to see is perhaps a war of a renewed conflict of attrition. I believe just as ISIS was pushed back against in the wake of its offensive, its lightning offensive in 2014 by the Iraqi state and its international allies, we're going to see a blunting of this remarkable rebel advance.
OK, a lot to unpack there. We will as we go through the programme, but it's not just about these forces, it's about the people, Fuad. You're the humanitarian on this panel. What reports are you getting about how people are coping, how many people are being displaced, how bad is the situation?
Yeah, thank you so much. In the beginning, I want to say that it was a real shock for us also as a humanitarian teams working in the area. And we weren't ready to do this, big emergency response. But from the day one, the people were asking for the help because around 5 million people were stuck in their houses in Aleppo city for some days. And then our teams joined yesterday morning with the other emergencies team to Aleppo city to try to provide the immediate need, the bread, food, and water for the people. as well as also our first responders and the first aiders were working in the hospitals because Aleppo has lost the most of the medical workers and the first aiders. And then we were able to work with the other organizations and White Helmets and other to respond for the attacks happening on the city from yesterday. Many attacks happened from the Russian and Syrian aircraft on the city of Aleppo, and we have like many reports on the people had dead and also injured people. But the situation is, the security situation is not stable yet. We are trying to also follow and track the displacement happening from Aleppo, but it's still not a big numbers. But if in our experience, if these attacks continue for 2 or 3 days more, 1 million of people will be displacing from Aleppo city to the northwest as well, as we had the big displacement before. Then it's we are around a very huge displacement if that's attacking on the city started or continue again in the coming days. And the humanitarian situation is getting back better in these days. Today we have, the people start to get out of their houses to get the immediate needs, and also the humanitarian organization joined. But there is still a big gap in the humanitarian assistance, the health supplies, and also in the hospitals as well.
OK, well, it is a confusing and rapidly changing situation right now in Syria. Might help, I think, to have a quick look at a map and look at who controls what, or at least has done recently in Syria. Syrian government forces backed by Russia and Iran regained control of large areas of the country during the civil war, which began 13 years ago. Opposition forces backed by Turkey remained in charge of parts across the north, with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham dominating Idlib province in the northwest. The Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, made up of mainly YPG Kurdish fighters and backed by the US, control much of northeastern Syria, including Raqqa, Hasaka and parts of Deir ez-Zor. This area is home to significant oil reserves. Turkey conducted 3 major incursions into northern Syria between 2016 and 2019 to create what's called a safe zone along its southern border. It wants the Kurdish-dominated SDF forces to leave Tal Rifat and Manbij and move east of the Euphrates. So bringing you up to date there on what the situation was, but of course it's moving very, very rapidly, Aymenn. Maybe I can ask you first to focus in on Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Exactly who is this group? It was part of al-Qaeda. What is the group? What are the characteristics of this group? And who else is involved in this offensive?
Yeah. So Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, it evolved out of Jabhat al-Nusra, which was Syria's al-Qaeda affiliate. The formation of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham marked the breaking of ties between al-Qaeda and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. There was a lot of unhappiness in al-Qaeda about what Jabhat al-Nusra did in forming this Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and breaking ties. So it is a genuine breaking of ties. The group's leadership is Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, who's Syrian. There are some foreign fighter contingents within the group, which is what arouses the concern of the international community, such as some Uzbeks and Albanians and Maldivians in the group. But it has genuinely broken its ties with al-Qaeda. But there are also other factions that have been participating in this offensive throughout northwest Syria. So factions from the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army, groups like the Shami Front of North Aleppo countryside. And you also have the Turkestan Islamic Party, which is Uyghur-led and is an ally of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, but an independent group. And then you have other more independent groups like Ahrar al-Sham, that's Syrian, Falak al-Sham, also Syrian. So it's a mixture of factions, but Hayat Tahrir al-Sham has been leading the charge.
OK, Ranj, do you think even they expected the success they've had? Do you think they expected to take this much territory? And if that's not the case, then is there a danger here of them overextending themselves?
Absolutely. So this lightning offensive by design is intended to catch its target off guard. In this case, the Assad regime, the Iranians and the Russians. It's designed to achieve significant potentially strategic gains in a very short window, almost similar to, like I say, the 2014 ISIS offensive, even the October 7 attack by Hamas. But that's very different to turning this into a strategic victory. And as you point out, there is a risk of overreach here, because what these groups now have to do is actually maintain their control of these territories, number one. Number two, that they need to mobilize in response to the coming pushback from the Iranians, the Russians, and the Assad regime. And three, it's a question of consolidation. And if the Syrian civil war has taught us anything, it's that these rebel groups, in fact, aren't particularly effective at keeping hold of territory and consolidating their positions in the face of very intense bombardment by the Russians through their airstrikes, in the face of very battle-hardened, rather effective militia groups aligned with Iran. And it's not simply a question of the forces that have been deployed in Syria over the past decade or so, but potentially other actors playing a more proactive role. And that includes, for example, the Popular Mobilization Force in Iraq, which already has some groups functioning, operating within the Syrian landscape. But we could see an expansion of these groups in Syria. So like I say, overextension, overreach, the ability to consolidate, maintain their positions. And three, the biggest question mark of all, can they withstand significant pressure from the Russians through its airstrikes and others?
And Fuad, those airstrikes have already started. We've already seen Russian bombardment, including the first Russian bombing of Aleppo since 2016, I think. I mean, this must be terrifying for the people of that city, which is the second city. It's not the capital. Damascus is the capital, but is actually the largest city in the country.
Yeah, it's also the economical capital in Syria, and that means that a lot of people, if the bombing continue, a lot of people will decide to leave immediately, and this is a huge factor that we should be aware of. And the bombing come to the main hospitals today. Today we have a report of bombing the Aleppo hospital, Aleppo University Hospital, where our team were there and get attacked directly on their ambulance. And that's actually put us on a factor that we have a deadline to stop that, and otherwise there will be a huge displacement. And also, the people didn't decide to displace under this attack, because also Idlib city has get attacked today and yesterday, and that's putting all the area in a risk of displacing or also moving around the area. And because it's very high and that very quick changing, the people are just stuck in the houses waiting for the news, because the opposition's soldiers arrived yesterday to Hama city, and that's putting the people in a case of just waiting for the news and trying to be updated from their houses. And that's actually putting us on facing the problem that we cannot also arranging the people in their houses to provide the immediate help as the food and water. And that's why our team trying also to go for the people house by house to help them. But it's still a huge city, and we need a very, very large scale of resources to help those millions of people and to provide the immediate needs for the life-saving and also the immediate food and water for the people in the city.
Aymenn, can I ask you about the response from Damascus? It took until Saturday for a statement to come out from President Assad. Confusion about his whereabouts, some suggestions that he was in Moscow and then returned to Damascus. Do you think there is worry there in the capital, in the centre of power, that he could lose complete control of the country, a country that his family have run for 54 years?
I do think that there's still a sense of alarm about the losses on the battlefield, but I don't think it's necessarily a sense of an imminent downfall. I mean, there have, of course, one has to remember that in this atmosphere, there has been the proliferation of false reports and rumors of an impending coup or coordination somehow between the Syrian military officers and the insurgent factions. So I think people perhaps are being a bit too hasty with that. It does remind me of when comparing with the Islamic State offensive in Iraq in 2014, that somehow the fall of Baghdad was imminent. So I think it's there should be a bit of caution on that. Definitely, there's a huge sense of crisis, but Assad's main allies, Russia and Iran, seem prepared to stand by him for now, and you're seeing that in the heavy joint Syrian-Russian bombardment of the areas that have been newly acquired by the insurgents. So really, the conflict's not imminently over, and I fear it's actually going to last for some time with a considerable amount of civilian deaths and displacement, unfortunately.
Ranj, let me bring you in there about these allies, because the ones that have helped out Assad all the way through his problems for the last 13 years are Russia, Iran and Hezbollah. Now, let's just take those three. How prepared do you think they are to help him out this time? Because all of those countries have other things going on, and Hezbollah is seriously degraded.
That's right. So I think from their perspective, and I think this reflects the reality, what they really need to do at this point is simply blunt the offensive and prevent it from developing a momentum that could present an existential threat to the Assad regime. And I think that's relatively straightforward, especially if you've got airstrikes at your disposal. So we're going to see over the next few days how things will develop on the ground. And I think, like other countries in the region and internationally, they'll be adopting a wait-and-see approach. But I don't think there's any, I don't think any one of those actors at the moment see this as an existential threat, but one that could develop into one. So if they look at it in different phases, right now it's simply about halting the rebel advance, inflicting as much damage as possible on them, bearing in mind that this will be done through indiscriminate attacks, which unfortunately will result in a severe humanitarian crisis, casualties to the civilian population. The Russians and the Iranians have no aversion towards conducting those kind of strikes and operations. So that's basically halting and blunting the rebel advance. Now, in terms of what comes next, in fact, they'll be looking at how other regional actors and international actors react to this advance. And what works in the favor of the Assad regime, the Russians and the Iranians, it's that the Turks don't want to take ownership of this advance, or they don't want to see it develop into something far more significant or a renewal of the civil war itself. The Americans most certainly haven't indicated just yet that they're going to be supporting this advance, or that they have an appetite for a renewal of the civil war. The fact is they don't. There is no appetite whatsoever in Washington, in Tel Aviv, in Ankara, and any of the other major regional Arab capitals for a renewal of this civil war. That doesn't work in favor of the rebels because they will need significant external support, patronage, to turn this into something more than simply a lightning offensive designed to take Aleppo or maybe other strategic towns and cities.
Fuad,
and what we've
if I could bring in Fuad now, as a humanitarian, how do you think the international community should respond to this? What do you want to see?
I mean, we're saying that the first thing that we should decide or also think about it is not putting Aleppo city under the bombing or any more fighting, because the huge displacement will happen in a days if that's happened. Then the only way that we're trying to say that protecting the civilians in the area, it's the priority of all of our work. That's what we are trying to advocate for, and also the otherwise is supporting the humanitarian actors and organization in the area, because we are in fact of that 1 million of people in the city need an immediate help. We should run and operate the hospitals, the water supply, and also distributing the immediate food and also the bread for the people. Then there is a huge need of the humanitarian support from the whole world. Then that's what we are trying to say. And also we are also looking to see how the situation will be in the next days. And based on that, we are trying to be more prepared for any emergencies response in the future or any displacement could be happened in the area.
Aymenn, of course, this comes at a time when the US is in transition. We know President Trump's instincts on Syria. There are 900 troops there, and he twice ordered that they be withdrawn last time he was president, and the Pentagon seemed to work around his orders and ignore them. What do you think the US's role here is, both with the outgoing administration and with the arrival of President Trump shortly?
Well, to be honest, the US role in this particular development and the offensive in the northwest, it's very limited because the US cut off its support for the insurgency, for select insurgent factions many years ago, and became very disengaged from that. And then the focus turned to this troop deployment in the northeast of the country and the east of the country, with supporting these Syrian democratic forces led by the Kurdish YPG. I think, though, there is a potential for the US to become more directly involved and brought into a dilemma about what it should do if the insurgent fighters, actually, particularly those in North Aleppo, move with Turkish approval on towards the town of Manbij, west of the Euphrates River. That was a long-standing Turkish concern about the presence of the Syrian democratic forces there, and the US has been involved in deployments in that area. So it could risk coming to a forefront for the US as to what it should do. Should it just stay or should it pull back? Really, it's anyone's guess about what happens with the Trump administration. His instincts for withdrawal versus advisors telling him to stay.
Ranj, very quickly, the US went there because of ISIL. Do you see any possibility that this could help a resurgence of ISIL? Very briefly, please.
ISIS thrives in situations of uncertainty, volatility. So absolutely, if you see a renewal of conflict, if there's an expanded conflict over the coming days, weeks and months, then ISIS will thrive. And I think that has implications for how the Trump administration engages Syria, that will have a bearing on its counterterrorism campaign in both Syria and Iraq, where there could be a spillover effect of current developments.
Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us today. Our guests were Ranj Alaaldin, Fuad Issa and Aymenn Jawad al-Tamimi. This, of course, is a fast-moving story. For all the latest developments, stay tuned to Al Jazeera. And remember, you can also get context and analysis on our app on your phone and at aljazeera.com. As ever, we want to hear from you too. Post your views on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or you can use X, where you'll find us at AJ Inside Story. I'll see you back here very soon. From me, James Bays, and all the team, bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.